Okay, so one way of looking at this would be to look at per capita GDP in absolute value. This is what we are doing. I should also mention that these are calculated in what is known as Khamishgiri dollars. Basically, it's to adjust for purchasing power and so on, so that we are looking at real income rather than nominal income, and it's measured in per capita terms. So as Mexico grows, the population of Mexico grows, it takes into account the fact that not the GDP per se, but GDP per capita, to adjust for that. Another cut of doing that, because as we saw how important the US is for Mexico, is to look at it as a percentage of US GDP. So the next figure looks at how much is Mexico's per capita GDP is in relation to the GDP per capita in the US. So here's a picture. Again, this goes back from 1900 onwards. So in 1900 to 1920, remember that's where the Mexican GDP was relatively low per capita. But as a percentage of the US GDP, this was hovering between 30 and 35%. So Mexico's per capita income in 1900 or 1910, before the end of Porfiriato, was about 1/3 of US GDP. Then it started to fall. And that reason basically is that the US economy has been growing steadily, whereas Mexican economy had not. And as a result, it fell to close to 15% in the early 1940s, and then it started growing as a proportion. So until 1945 or so, between 1945 and 1981, Mexican economy grew again at a rate higher than the corresponding US growth, and as a result, this ratio has grown. Again, it went up to 35%. 1981, it hit a high point, and then it has fallen during the last decades, and it has been more or less steady from 1998 onwards. So this is the picture, and this to some extent explains why we see waves of migration towards the US. As you can imagine, that as Mexico becomes poorer relative to its neighbor, this gives incentive for people to go across the border. This is not the only reason, but this is one of the driving forces for that. The other driving force, of course, is demographics. Now, why had Mexican GDP per capita behaved the way it has in our picture? Well, one way of looking at it would be to look at productivity growth of these three countries together. So what we do here is we do a bit of analysis of how has the productivity of a typical Mexican worker compare with that of the US and that of Canada. This data that we have is between 1950 and 2010. What we see here, for example, the top bit here is that of the US. US productivity has grown steadily. They were producing index was about 12 in 1950, and if we go to the far end of the thing, it's about 40. So that much it has grown. Canada doesn't grow as much, but fairly closely follow the US until in the late 1990s. Whereas in Mexico, it grew. The productivity, first of all, there is always a gap between the productivity of a Mexican worker and the US since the Second World War, end of Second World War, but it has grown until again the story of productivity growth happens until 1981, and ever since then it has been pretty much stagnant. It has grown just a little bit. Another way of looking at it would be to look at how productivity growth affects the GDP growth in Mexico. So here's a scatter plot of productivity growth and GDP growth in Mexico over the last 6 decades. And what it shows is that there's a very clear positive relationship between the two, and they move pretty much in tight relationship. Growth in productivity and growth in GDP per capita is very, very close. So when we explain that the productivity growth has been low, that actually explains why the GDP growth has also been correspondingly low. Here's another cut of that. This time we look at Mexico, US, and for good measure, we throw in one of the Asian tiger countries, Korea. So these are productivity growths over the last 2 decades for Korea, Mexico, and the US. The red line there is that of Mexico, the blue line there that of Korea, and the green line is that of the US. So here's the summary on the top right hand side of my slide. It says the productivity growth of Korea over the last 20 years have been averaging about 5%. In the US it has been averaging about 2%. In Mexico it has been averaging about 0.2%. 0.5%. So the productivity growth in Mexico has been much lower than the US, and of course it has been much lower than Korea. In fact, if you go back to comparison of Korea and Mexico in 1980, GDP per capita in Korea was lower in 1980 than Mexico, and it is about twice as high as that of Mexico. And the reason again is not surprising, it's basically a productivity story. The other part of the story is that if we look at the productivity growth of Mexico, the other striking fact is the variability that it has sustained even in that period of time. There's been a lot of ups and downs in that period of time. Every time there has been an economic downturn, that has been accompanied by a dramatic decline in productivity, in labor productivity. And that is one of the important things to keep in mind when we talk about Mexico's economic growth. However, productivity growth is not necessarily the whole story about why the GDP grows. Here is the example of the US. This is the US productivity growth versus how much each worker earns. So, if you look at this is for the US from 1948 to 2012. So between 1948 and 1971, the growth in hourly compensation and productivity has been growing very close to each other. But then they diverged. And that has not changed at all. So 1971 onwards, productivity in the US has grown from about 120 to 240, so productivity has doubled. Nevertheless, average compensation of worker has only grown by 8%. So productivity growth and GDP growth does not always move in tandem, and not surprisingly, it's the same period where we see in the US there has been a tremendous increase in inequality. Now, a lot has been said about Mexico versus China. There has been tons of articles saying that China has been eating Mexico's lunch, and it is indeed true that Mexico used to be the second largest important country in terms of export to the US. Now it is number 3. First one has always been Canada, but China has overtaken Mexico in terms of their exports to the US. So how does China today compare with Mexico? Here's a picture. In the top part, it tells you the Mexican GDP per working age person. The second one, GDP per capita. Obviously, not everybody in the economy works. As a result, there's a gap. And that, if you compare that of China, you will see that China still has a long way to go in either GDP per working person or GDP per capita to catch up with Mexico. So to say, Mexico has lost the battle with China is a bit premature. China has started from a lot lower base, and as a result, it is not at all clear that China will overtake Mexico over the next decade. In fact, there are some hypothesis, Tim Kehoe and his team have argued that, in fact, what we would expect is that China would have the same sort of pattern until about 2020, and then it's going to stop. Mainly the argument has been demographics, that China's population is aging very, very rapidly, and while they are catching up, it's not at all clear that China will take over the world, kind of story. One other important element of Mexico's story is that of violence. As is well known, the violence mostly related to drugs and narco-traffickers to the US has been an important element in Mexican history since at least 2006-07, for earlier periods as well. But this is where the violence really took off in conjunction with drug trafficking. And indeed it is true that if we look at the cities, most violent cities in the world, these are the top 10, and 4 or 5 of them are from Mexico. However, it is also important to keep in mind they are not all from Mexico. So for example, Brazil appears in 2 in the top 10. Yet it's surprising that most people do not talk about how violent Brazil is, but they do talk about how violent Mexico is. Honduras, which is a very small country, also features two cities of Honduras also feature in the top 10. Again, we do not hear that much about violence in Honduras. Similarly, for Venezuela. Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, is one of the most violent cities in the world. And these numbers are calculated in terms of homicides per capita. So, the denominator is taken into account. And one of the cities that appear there is Ciudad Juarez, which is actually bordering the US and Mexico. The interesting thing about Ciudad Juarez is that the corresponding US side of the city, the twin cities of Ciudad Juarez, does not report any violence above the US average. So when people talk about violence spilling over to the north of Mexico, it really does not have any statistical validity to it.